Speaker of the House Mike Johnson has privately admitted he's going to be trying to push Ukraine aid through by Easter. But just what obstacles are still in his way? And is the Russian propaganda machine ramping up its spin, trying to turn the tragedy in Moscow into an excuse to target Ukraine? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of it. Okay, first off, this is probably the biggest story, probably this quarter, honestly. This is Johnson vowing the U.S. will, quote, do our job as he looks for a path forward on Ukraine, which is a interesting pivot from someone who deliberately stalled out Ukraine aid. But what he told a Ukrainian NGO head at a closed-door luncheon fundraiser in New Jersey, he admitted that he was asked, he was shared the adage that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil was for good people to do nothing. Johnson said, quote, that's not going to be us, he assured her. We're going to do our job, right? And this exchange, of course, reflects what Johnson has privately told many donors, foreign leaders, and fellow members of Congress in recent weeks, that he is planning on pushing through Ukraine aid. But good intentions are not enough, as we've seen repeatedly in this war. There's still a large contingent of Republicans, including Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from the educated state of Georgia, who has said she would call a vote to try to unseat the speaker if he was to vote for Ukraine aid before imposing restrictive immigration measures, according to a resolution Friday. She wanted to, quote, send him a warning. But strangely enough, it perhaps a moment of bipartisanship, right? That's how serious the elected representatives are taking Ukraine aid, that even a number of Democrats, according to some sort of quasi off the book statements by Hakeem Jeffries, said that some Democrats would actually step up to save Mike Johnson in order to confirm that you're not going to be ousted for passing Ukraine aid, something that in almost every poll is supported by a majority of Americans who feel that the U.S., in fact, a large majority of Americans feel that the U.S.'s current levels of aid to Ukraine are either adequate or not enough. So a really interesting perspective here. Let's see if I can find this polling data for you guys. This is from December. So this is from a couple months ago. But you could see this is when there was debate about sending. So this was asked at a time when the U.S. was providing lots of lethal aid to Ukraine. And in the aggregate, the number of people who was like, the U.S. is either not providing enough or providing about the right level of support, again, as of like November, added up to about 66% of Americans, with about 22% not sure. Of course, the majority of people who think we're providing too much aid to those Ukrainians is about 50, even less than 50% of Republicans, right? So I thought this was really interesting and a good reminder that even among Republicans, where they are kind of Ukraine skeptics, even a majority of Republicans are either supportive of Ukraine aid or not really sure if we're doing enough, which honestly, I understand the people who are like, I'm not sure either, because, well, at that time, right, we looked at the failure of the counteroffensive, and there were questions about whether NATO aid had really made that much of a difference. And I think, unfortunately, tragically, we only learned how valuable U.S. aid was after watching the fall of Avdiivka, right? Now, what's interesting, too, really fascinating, is that Mr. Johnson expressed interest in linking Ukraine aid to a measure aimed at forcing the Biden administration to reverse its moratorium on liquid natural gas exports, which seemed like kind of a unusually nitpicky issue. Now, according to Johnson, he says, well, when the U.S. can sell its liquid natural gas abroad, we are going to be able to stop Russia from selling its liquid natural gas to others, right? By blocking this liquid natural gas export, Russia has effectively taken a large producer, the United States, out of the market. And what's fascinating is, of course, Johnson is like, well, it's going to actually hurt Putin by putting this stuff out there. But what's even more fascinating is that it just so happens that there's someone who stands to benefit from a large increase in liquid natural gas exports. Why? It's a proposed terminal that would be situated in Lake Charles, Louisiana, in the very district of Representative Johnson. In fact, it would be the largest of the country's liquid natural gas export terminals. And the Biden administration, of course, in January, paused the decision on whether to approve it, which is interesting, really interesting. So it's hard to know, right? This may have been a personal FU to Speaker Johnson to say, listen, if you want to play these games, we can play games too. Or it could have been the thing that set Mike Johnson on this path of delaying Ukraine aid, something the Biden administration really wants. So really fascinating that, again, this is something that this is the first time I've heard about it in the news at all. And it may be like central to understanding the conflict and why Ukraine aid has been so hard to get through, right? This is pretty fascinating, right? When you look up the actual name of this terminal, again, central to moving Ukraine aid out of the House, nobody's talking about it. Nobody, right? So really, really interesting, right? The New York Times kind of talked about it, but talked about it only in terms of like climate issues. So again, you can always count on the news to just miss a bunch of key context. But here's what I thought was also interesting and worth acknowledging, right? Is that I talked earlier about the fact that Speaker Johnson has been linked in the past to Russian-affiliated organizations. And some of the Russian-affiliated organizations who donated to his earlier campaigns were associated with energy companies, right? Which can include liquid natural gas interests. But I thought it really fascinating that, Speaker Johnson waited to release Ukraine aid until after Putin's election, after the Russians took the town of Avdiivka, something that they needed prior to Putin's election. And only now is he considering releasing aid. To sit there and be like, oh, well, that proves he's not compromised by the Russians. I actually think that's up for debate. Because again, Russia doesn't always demand like total absolute loyalty, right? That sometimes outs people. And oftentimes it's simply better to just have the key people just willing to delay things in ways that benefit Russia, right? Sometimes it's just a conspiracy theory when someone argues that there's a puppet master pulling all the strings, but Russia actually has proven itself capable of doing like sometimes a relatively sophisticated level of puppeteering. And if you told me that delaying Ukraine aid prior to the election, allowing Russian forces to achieve a victory that Putin can in turn tout, was all part of the plan, I would absolutely believe it. Now, guys, if you know that before I talk about this other issue, YouTube has been on a demonetization like tear. Truly, I have had of my last like 4 videos, 2 of them have been demonetized, right? For really weird, unclear reasons, even when I go through and censor them. And so that means that, of course, if you want some of this uncensored combat footage and my analysis of it, which I think is important to understanding the whole war, you want to become a member at combatvetnews.com. And the members of Combat Vet News, you are the guys that support this channel, that enable me to continue to do this every day, right? YouTube ad revenue, it's like a little bit, especially now with the heavy demonetization that's happening to small commentary channels, small news channels like mine. It's an election year, and as you know, big tech has a very strong stance that if you're not a major news outlet, you probably don't deserve a voice, right? You're a liability, and you guys know the sort of coverage I provide here, right? I try to give you guys a depth and perspective of the Ukraine conflict that you don't get through major news outlets. So if you want to support what I do and you want access to twice a week uncensored combat footage, not just from Ukraine, but from Israel or from Gaza, as well as other conflict zones around the world, you want to become a member. Obviously, specialist tiers will get you access But if you want to support additionally, the lieutenant tier, the colonel tier, you can get that shout out at the end of the videos. So thank you so much to you guys. And a new video is dropping today. So definitely check it out. We might even take a look at this viral video that I can't show on YouTube, depicting what is the most brazen, I can't even talk about it, but it's coming from Gaza and it's created quite a stir. We're going to check it out. Anyway, let's talk about the Russian spin machine, right? Okay, so the Russians have found themselves in a pretty embarrassing position, really embarrassing, in fact. And here is why, right? Well, as you guys know, a couple days ago, the Islamic State Khorasan, ISK, staged an attack on civilians in Moscow's Crocus City Hall during a concert, right? This was a targeted terror attack. And after it occurred, ISIS-K released a statement saying this was us. And in fact, ISIS-K a couple days later released body cam footage saying this is, you know, this was us because we literally have the footage, right? They sent us the footage, the perpetrators. And what's obvious is that this was a almost unbelievable failure of Russian intelligence and law enforcement. And it absolutely makes sense, right? You cannot focus on two things at once. And it's fairly clear that the Russian intelligence apparatus is 99% focused on Ukraine, right? And so that means that other potential threats have fallen by the wayside. And similarly with law enforcement, we've seen a number of Russian law enforcement units or Ministry of Interior troops deployed to Ukraine, leaving only a much more underpowered contingent securing major cities, right? And so it makes sense that in that context, that someone like ISIS-K would be able to stage a pretty, I'm trying to think of the right word here, a pretty grisly attack, right? Now, but things are even more embarrassing for Russia, right? Because remember that when you have an authoritarian leader, right, you lose a lot of your freedoms. But what you're supposed to gain is strength and decisiveness, right? That decisive leader is supposed to keep you safe. That is the fundamental trade-off that authoritarians make, right? That's why so many authoritarians will, if they don't have a real threat to respond to, they'll conjure one up. For example, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He is out there. He routinely tells his people, listen, the United States has an army on the border, and only with my total strength and commitment can we hold them off and stop the imperialists from invading us. Meanwhile, South Korea is like a tourist destination, right? Like, it's obviously untrue, but they need it to be true in order to maintain their control. So when the Russians back someone like Putin, they're expecting him to be to keep the country safe. And the fact that he is unable to secure even a concert hall in the heart of Moscow, embarrassingly, less than 3 kilometers from the headquarters of Moscow's special purpose mobile unit, their SWAT teams, right? Literally right next door to the SWAT teams. And they still could not get there in less than an hour, which is preposterous. Now, what's even worse, Putin somehow even managed to embarrass himself further because the U.S. intelligence community itself told Russia pretty specifically that ISIS-K wanted to carry out attacks in Russia. And in fact, the U.S. embassy publicly warned U.S. citizens within Russia to avoid gathering at concerts because of this threat. And yet, right, Russia did nothing about this. In fact, Putin put out a statement about the embassy's warnings, calling them, quote, provocative statements, and saying that it was an attempt to destabilize Russia. Right? But here's the embarrassing part. Putin accidentally, right, acknowledged it, right? So the fact that he made this public statement about it said he couldn't claim, oh, the U.S. didn't tell us, or no one told me, Vladimir Putin, about it. Literally, Putin heard these warnings because he talked about how he heard the warnings and how angry it made him, right? So it's incredibly almost comically embarrassing. Now, will it affect Putin's ability to rule Russia? No, he's killed like 100,000 of his own citizens in this pointless war. A few more civilians and an epic intelligence failure, barely on the radar, right? But what's fascinating is, of course, that, right, Putin has spent a lot of time spinning the narrative that the United States hates Russia and wants only bad things to happen to them. But then to acknowledge that the U.S. told you this was going to happen, and then you took no meaningful actions, is just a total affront. And so Russia is in flashing red light propaganda damage control mode. No doubt about it. And you can see that they're pushing on all fronts. Ultranationalist mill bloggers, public statements by the FSB director themselves, trying kind of to like squeeze this in to blaming Ukraine for this attack. And the thing is, there's no evidence, none. The only thing that they point to is that the perpetrators, who were Tajik, by the way, you can see Tajikistan bordering Afghanistan, another very, very mountainous region with a large population of Muslims. You can see that Ukraine, if you committed a crime in Moscow and you needed to flee to a country that would not extradite you, you basically want to go to Ukraine. That's your fastest route. Your fastest one is, right, you can get to Belarus quicker, but it's Belarus, right? They're basically Russia light. And then you can't run to a NATO country because NATO, they hate you worse, right? You really want to come to Latvia and be like, help, I'm a literal ISIS terrorist. Latvia is going to be like, we got a spot for you in our jail, right? So they were probably like, listen, there's only one chance, and that's to take advantage of the chaos of a war zone, right? This is the only border in the world that is, well, contested. And that's probably what they were trying to do. Now, their hope was probably to make it to the border and then probably try to exploit something, maybe try to get in. And maybe they thought, you know what, Ukraine's going to shelter us. They hate Russia. We struck a blow against Russia. Again, it's a war crime. They are criminals. Well, it's not a war crime because they're not belligerents in a war. It's just a regular terror attack. Right? It'd be a war crime if they were Ukrainian. Does that make sense? So they probably thought maybe Ukraine would like shelter them, but Ukraine still has a strong relationship with the United States, and the United States would be like, no. Those guys, you just put them in a jail cell, and we are going to have some of our people who are already in Ukraine, who just have only first names, and they are going to just take them in a van and they will get zipped off somewhere where the U.S. will learn everything they need to know about those guys. And then the U.S. probably would turn them over to Moscow and be like, here you go, because that would, again, be an even greater propaganda coup to return to the perpetrators of the largest terror attack, return to you by the United States. It would be just chef's kiss, a little too perfect. So the spin machine is trying their absolute best to try to link this to Ukraine. And the reason is not only to avoid the intense embarrassment it causes Russian leader Vladimir Putin, but also because Putin needs to have more excuses to escalate the war. As we talked about 3 or 4 days before this occurred, Putin made a bunch of statements how he viewed the special military operation as having transitioned into a full-fledged war. And that is that's a huge narrative shift for Putin, who up until this point had emphasized kind of the limited nature of this and sort of the vague goals and terms. So he wanted a thing to use as a propaganda event to sell the war, so to speak, to the Russian people, or sell an escalation of the war to the Russian people. And instead, what he got was this tragedy that exposed his government for being kind of the ineffective, stretched too thin, just under strength entity that it is. So again, here's kind of the headline from Ground News, right? Russia cast doubt on Islamic State responsibility for the concert attack. Again, when the U.S. says this is who it was, and the ISIS-K themselves say it was us, we have the body cam footage. Well, Moscow's still going to be like, nah, right? Putin ignores IS to better gag critics is one of the top headlines. I mean, you can see all these. This is fascinating. Look at Russia Today. Look at how hard Russia Today is trying to spin this headline. The headline is White House comments on possible Ukrainian involvement in Moscow terror attack. And then the White House's comment is, no, that's dumb, right? ISIS bears sole responsibility, and there's absolutely no evidence Ukraine was involved. But you see how, with the right massaging, even a headline of like even this headline is just trying its absolute best to link these two, right? So anyway, guys, that is all I had. Certainly, I'll see you guys over on combatvetnews.com. Thanks to the Colonel tier members. Thanks to all the Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. Hit like and subscribe on the video. Tell the YouTube algorithm this is good stuff. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.